Now, because NMO doesn't actually exist anywhere, what follows is necessarily imaginary. So let's begin by imagining a country at some time in the future. Let's call it A1. The first and most important feature to notice about A1 is that its government is a real democracy, i.e. one where the people, properly informed, have real decision-making power. It's an advance on the old Swiss model, which was about the best model of government that existed until the ideological revolution happened that created A1. A1's government isn't owned outright by bankers and corporations, as the old so-called democracies were, and its first duty is to value and protect the interests of all its people, not just the interests of 1% of the people, which is what old governments used to do. In A1, the state has a duty to ensure that all citizens have enough of everything they need: nourishing food, clean water, good clothing, safe housing, security, justice, healthcare, education, power, communications, public transport, and so on. In return for the state providing these essentials, the citizen is expected either to pay taxes or to contribute some of their labour towards providing those goods and services. The amount of labour provided is seldom onerous, usually about 20 hours a week, and often less. This leaves the citizen plenty of time to do other things if she chooses to, further education perhaps, or to work in the private sector if she wants to, or to just enjoy the company of family and friends. A1 has a much smaller private sector than used to exist, but it's nevertheless a healthy and successful private sector, for although the state provides everything the citizen really needs in order to have a healthy, well-informed, comfortable and happy life, it does so without any frills. It provides good and plentiful vegan food, for example, but nothing in the way of animal products. Therefore, the private sector, properly regulated by the state, is able to supply foods and other commodities based on animal products for those who want them at whatever profit it can make. The state also supplies good housing for anyone who needs it, but is fairly basic housing, intended only to be safe, clean, peaceful and comfortable. The private sector, properly regulated by the state, is able to provide a range of alternative housing for whatever profit it can make, and so on. The state ensures there is enough of everything the citizen needs. The private sector is free to provide for those who want more. The state also manages a network of communes, which provide the main interface between the state and the citizen. A commune contains whatever administration offices and other facilities are needed to provide a full range of public services in any particular area. So communes might have police, fire and ambulance stations, say, schools, clinics, arable farms and market gardens, public works buildings and small industrial units, as well as public housing facilities, communal kitchens, parks and recreation grounds, etc. Not very different to the kibbutzim in what used to be known as occupied Palestine, say. But the communes in A1 are usually much larger. Outside of the communes, the private sector, properly regulated by the state, operates specialist farms, industrial units, shopping malls, and whatever else in the way of non-essential goods and services that are not supplied by the state, for whatever profit it can make. The state produces and supplies whatever money it needs in order to maintain its operations using a system of public banks. The money is legal tender anywhere in the country, and the private sector is obliged to accept it on conditions determined by the state. But the private sector may also use other currencies as well. Private banks are free to operate just like any other private business. But just like any other private business, they too are properly regulated by the state. The money created by the state in A1 is based on units of labour. The standard unit of currency is called the pound. Anyone working in the public sector is paid at the rate of £5 an hour, no matter what the work they do. And the quantity of pounds produced by the state depends on the number of people working in the public services. Pounds are legal tender anywhere in A1, and any private business is obliged to accept them at rates determined by the state. Payments to public servants are in addition to other free goods and services, such as free vegan meals in communal kitchens, say, free healthcare and education, basic housing, free local public transport, and so on. The state guarantees to provide at least 20 hours of work a week in one of the public services to anyone who needs work, and the £100 a week that could thus be earned can be spent purchasing goods in the private sector. In addition to using pounds as standard currency in A1, the private sector is also able to trade in other currencies, including the global currency unit. We must now take account of one other very important consideration: foreign trade. To properly understand this fact, it's necessary to leave our thought experiment for a minute and consider the reality of a little historical context. If France had been left alone to find its own way immediately after the French Revolution, the Terror would probably never have happened, and Napoleon would never have been heard of. And if ordinary working people of other countries had been free to reshape their own governments at that time along the lines of the new French Republic, as many wanted to do, the world would have developed into a very different place. World War I would not have happened, which means that Adolf Hitler and World War II would never have been heard of. But the French people were not left alone to develop their revolution, because the rest of Europe's 1% of the time were horrified at the possibility of economic justice breaking out in their countries too. The fear of the 1%, mingled with the heady smell of plunder to be had in a weakened, vulnerable France, was too irresistible an opportunity to miss. The Terror and the Napoleonic Wars, which is how everyone thinks of the French Revolution today, became inevitable, not through any serious flaws in the revolutionary model itself, but because of the interference of powerful foreign elites. And the rest, as they say, is history. So too, after the Russian Revolution. If the Russian people had been left alone to work out how their new regime might work, the world would have evolved in a very different way. But once again, the interfering 1% of foreign countries, terrified of the prospect that the oppressed 99% of their own populations might be inspired by the Russians and get ideas above their station, were having none of it. From its very earliest days, Russian socialism, with its scary possibility of economic justice for the 99%, was the bitter and avowed enemy of Western elites. It had to go. Quite apart from the military assaults that were hurled by Western 1%ers against post-revolutionary France and post-revolutionary Russia, there was the added complication of economic isolation, the trade embargoes and international banking restrictions imposed by foreign plutocrats. The further examples of Cuba and North Korea prove the point. Here were two countries who resisted imperial capitalism and fought off relentless foreign plots and invasions in order to do so. But there was no way gangster capitalism was going to accept defeat, so the gangster capitalist countries enforced crippling trade embargoes and financial restrictions on both of those countries that lasted well over half a century. The mighty propaganda machine of the gangster capitalists loved to sneer at the struggling economies of both those little countries and claim their apparent poverty was because of the socialist economic model they chose to use. The propaganda never ever gave full weight to the fact that North Korea and Cuba endured devastating trade embargoes and impossible financial restrictions. The 1%ers propaganda machine never invited people to wonder what the economies of the supposedly great Western countries would look like if they too were forbidden to trade with anyone. In other words, it's essential that countries are allowed to trade freely with each other if they wish to do so, that no one nation can dictate which trading partners other nations may have, or control the terms of trade that countries agree with each other. It's perfectly reasonable that the country of origin of goods and services is clearly labelled, so that ordinary individuals may decide for themselves whether or not to purchase those goods or services. But it is not acceptable for a government to make that decision for them. For many centuries, the powerful nations have always consolidated their power by controlling how other nations trade. This has always resulted in the impoverishment of the weak nations and the obscene enrichment of tiny handfuls of elites in the controlling nations. This is the basic story of empire. It's thousands of years old, and it's still as alive and well today as it was when the plundering Romans swept through Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. So now we need to return to our thought experiment and take it one stage further and visualize a global model based on Enmo economics. In this model, because of the ideological revolution that created Enmo, the world comprises many other countries whose governments are very similar to that of A1, i.e. directly controlled by the people of that country, properly informed. No one country rules and controls the world as empires did for thousands of years. And international relations are administered and coordinated by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So any two countries who wish to trade with each other have an inviolable right to do so. Because all countries are similarly administered, there is no need for tightly controlled borders. And people, together with lawful goods and services, can move without restrictions between countries, just as easily as they used to move in the 20th century from one town to another. Like A1, each country also has its own locally produced currency, and each country administers its own currency in its own way. These local currencies are specific to the country that produces them, so are not legal tender in other countries, and cannot be traded between private banks in other countries. Trade throughout the world is administered by a central body called the Centre for Global Trade and Banking, CGTB, which is itself administered and controlled by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Its purpose is to ensure that any country may be able to trade freely for essential goods and services with any other country. In addition to every country producing its own local currency, there is also a global currency produced by the CGTB. It's called the dollar. Like local currencies, it too is not linked to any other commodity, but is recognized as legal tender anywhere in the world. Recall that our existing monetary system is also based on nothing at all. Each year, every country in the world may automatically apply for and receive a standard allocation of dollars from the CGTB, which is then managed by the central bank of that country. The main purpose of these dollars is to enable a country to buy from other countries whatever essential goods or services it cannot provide for itself. And the quantity of dollars each country receives depends upon the size of its population and what it actually needs. So if country D7, say, exports more essential goods and services than it imports, it would have a trade surplus of dollars and might not need any more of them from the CGTB. But if country P3 needs to import more essential goods than it can export, it only needs to ask for more, and we will automatically receive an allocation based on the number of people living there and the quantity of essentials it needs for the following year. Dollars are not loans, so never need to be repaid. A demurrage system is used instead, such that the value of dollars produced in any particular year decays to nothing after 5 years. They are simply monetary instruments whose primary purpose is to ensure that no country ever needs to be without essential goods or services, and any country has a right to receive a reasonable allocation of them from the CGTB. Private banks are regulated by the country where they operate as well as the CGTB, which also broadly defines the difference between essential and non-essential goods. In the next part of this talk, I'll briefly summarize ENMO and then consider one other issue that's vitally important to the global economy: human overpopulation.